Welcome to a special episode of the British Broadcasting Century podcast. We go out of our regular timeline for one episode, in which we'll be looking at pirate radio, especially Radio Caroline, thanks to Radio Caroline expert and author Ray Clark. His book is Radio Caroline, the true story of the boat that rocked, and he joins us this episode to tell us all about it. Plus a little from me on BBC engineer R.H. Wood. He was the guy in charge of Outside Broadcast. I'm doing a show about him at Leicester Comedy Festival this very week, if you're incredibly quick. Might do it again at some point. So I've been digging into some old archive recordings of classic broadcasts that R.H. Wood was responsible for. I'll play you a couple of them in this episode. So that's official BBCdom and very unofficial pirate radio here on the British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is London Calling.
Hello, welcome to the podcast. It's Paul Carenza here. Thanks for joining us. I did promise you last time. Well, I say promise. I never promise anything. But my intent was to bring us back into our regular timeline of 1923. We've reached November there, and it's just before the BBC's first anniversary, and it's the first broadcast armistice. Now, that episode is still in the editing oven. It's quite a beast. Sometimes you know what it's like on this podcast. If you've listened before, you'll know that sometimes now and then we have some rather complex and dense archive-based stories to bring you, whether that's digging into some old classic clips or finding out the truth behind a story or pulling on lots of different threads and going through old academic theses and wireless magazines. Anyway, for whatever reason then, next time will hopefully be the first broadcast armistice on the podcast. So this time I thought, well, let's bring you something where I know we have an expert who can give us one straight, clear, nice story. The tale of pirate radio, especially Radio Caroline, courtesy of a man who's been involved in Radio Caroline for decades now, and he's written the book all about it. Radio Caroline, the true story of the boat that rocked. It's Ray Clark. He'll be here very shortly. But first of all, a quick plug for my Leicester Comedy Festival show. It's on this very weekend, so odds are you've missed it or you're not near Leicester. But if you are in time, Saturday 7th of February, 2 o'clock in the afternoon at the King Richard III Visitor Centre, 4 Monarchs and a mic, the BBC's Royal Engineer. This is one of those rather nerve-wracking things for me, although I'm a performer and a writer and do this lovely podcast about radio history. It's always nerve-wracking doing a thing for the first time. So this is the debut show of 4 Monarchs and a mic. It's the true tale of R.H. Wood. Not a name that pretty much anyone would be familiar with, even if you know your radio history. But he's the engineer who brought to the microphone 4 Monarchs, George V.
I wish you all, my dear friends, a happy Christmas.
Edward VIII.
A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor.
George
Myself.
and Elizabeth II.
Thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers.
As well as war broadcasts, sports broadcasts, he was the guy in charge of engineering Outside Broadcasts. His book is called A World in Your Ear. It's one of my favourite books, and if you can get hold of a copy, I highly recommend it. And it's a lovely memoir of the dedicated life that he gave to give us these classic broadcasts. He started the BBC at 2ZY Manchester, about a year into the BBC's life. He ended his career in 1964, and so, of course, along those 4 decades, that includes everything from the first sporting Outside broadcasts, coronations, abdications, funerals. We've got some classic clips, including these, all courtesy of that engineer I'll be talking about this Saturday in Leicester, R.H. Wood.
This is Windsor Castle.
Come on, Margaret.
His Royal Highness Prince Edward. I have found it impossible
The Battle of Britain is about to begin.
to carry the heavy burden of responsibility
When's the lad? Look, when's the lad's won it?
and to discharge my duties as King
No. Yes, when's the lad?
as I would wish to do,
Terrific. When's the lad wins?
without the help and support
One of the greatest boat races ever had.
of the woman I love.
Oxford in the lead, I think.
Consequently,
Level, I should think. I'm not quite sure.
this country
Cambridge picking up the stroke.
is at war with Germany.
I think Cambridge are ahead. I don't know who's ahead. It's either Oxford or Cambridge.
They're off again. They're changing over. It's Wales' kick this time.
Flames are moving at the rate of about a yard in every 5 minutes.
It is very simple, this lying in state of a dead king.
The roof is coming crashing down in sections.
1 minute, the train's leaving in 1 minute, is it? Well, now, children, come on, give 'em a song as you go.
If the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Good night, children. Good night, and good luck to you all.
Sport and royalty. Obviously the essential foundations for any British broadcasting service.
And the voice there of Peter Eckersley summing up the very heart of British culture and British broadcasting. Stay tuned at the very end of this episode. I'll bring you probably R.H. Wood's most infamous broadcast that he engineered, the drunken commentary of Tommy Woodroffe. The fleet is all lit up, and so's Tommy. You'll hear it at the very end. But first, we go from as official as British broadcasting can get, with coronations and state funerals, to as unofficial as British broadcasting can surely get. The tale of the boat that rocked, it's Radio Caroline, and this is our special guest for this episode, author and broadcaster, Ray Clark. Delighted to welcome to the British Broadcasting Century podcast, broadcaster, author, expert in Radio Caroline and those glory years of pirate radio, Ray Clark. Hello, Ray.
Hello, Paul. Thank you for inviting me, and nice to be called an expert as well.
Expert, absolutely.
So
Well, you
I've
are.
never been an expert before.
Current. But your book, Radio Caroline, the true story of the boat that rocked. Were this a visual medium, one would see me holding it up to the camera right now. So Radio Caroline is your book, but tell us about your way into this story and indeed your connections with it as well. Now, there's so much we could talk about.
Gosh, it is a bonkers story, Paul. You think the BBC's history is bonkers. This is really bonkers. And of course, it's not just Caroline. It goes back to the advent of the BBC, because commercial radio has been around, or the dream and wish of commercial radio had been around for years and years and years. For me, the spark was lit on Good Friday, Easter Saturday, whenever it was I first heard Radio Caroline in 1964. And I distinctly, you get people every week that you're on the air on Caroline coming up and saying, I was listening to their first broadcast. But one memory I have got was on Easter Monday, saying to my mum as we looked at the back page of the Daily Mirror, that's that radio station we've been listening to. And it amazes me that word got around all those years ago, pre-social media, no advertising. Within days, the listening figures for Caroline, 7 million people. How did that happen? Gosh. And it just lit the spark. And I just loved the idea, I think, of a guy, and they were guys in those days, just throwing up over the side of a rusty old ship just to play me the latest Beatles record in it. And I thought, I want to do that. I want to do that.
So that caught the bug for you, not just in the Radio Caroline story, but to do radio yourself, which you've done for many years. Was the spark? This was the spark.
Yeah, most certainly. I was only 10 at the time, but up until then, we lived in the country. It was a different world that I lived in. My dad worked on the farm. I wanted to do the same as him. I wanted to milk cows and drive tractors. And then once a year, when the fair came into town, I wanted to be the guy that stood on the walster and turned the tubs round as the girls screamed. But from that moment on, it was to be the radio. I took possibly the longest probable or possible route to get on the radio that any broadcaster has ever done, but I did eventually make it thanks to Radio Caroline.
Yeah, so your own career then has included, of course, Radio Caroline and BBC, and what's great about an interview like this is one can hear your voice. You can hear the soft, dulcet tones that calm us, reassure us, and just, you know radio inside out, don't you?
It was never like that, Paul, in the start. I had the broadest Essex accent you could ever imagine. And I've got demo tapes, some that I never sent off, but I've still got them. And I'd listen to them and I'd say, hello, that's Ray Clark here, and here's the record from the Beatles. And nobody's going to give me a job with that. Of course, nowadays, accents like that, God, I'd be doing the continuity on BBC Two, wouldn't I?
I suppose so. Exactly. Quite right, too. It's where we all belong. Well, so this podcast that we do here, the British Broadcasting Century podcast, has, for many, erroneously, and including by me probably, been called like history of the BBC. But actually, we're trying to do British broadcasting as a whole. And in terms of the non-BBC broadcasting story, I mean, arguably, Radio Caroline's going to be one of the first in terms of those, before commercial rivals and the like. The Radio Caroline story is one of those first non-BBC stories to do with broadcasting.
Well, no, actually, quite a few before that. But I'm quite proud still to be associated with Caroline, and I take great joy in saying that Caroline is now Britain's second longest established radio broadcaster. Wow. And if you took into account the fact that Radio 1 and Radio 2 used to be the light program and Radio 4 used to be the home service, then you could, I suppose, stretching the truth, say Radio Caroline is the longest and oldest radio station in Britain. But that's cheating a little bit. But if you go back to the BBC days, which I know from going to your talks, I've been to a couple of them, Paul, and enjoyed them, and listening to the podcast and seeing the stuff that you put up on social media, the British Broadcasting Company became the British Broadcasting Corporation. But hang on a minute here, you BBC. I mean, I worked for 22 years at the BBC, but there's a bit of holier than thou there, because the British Broadcasting Company was a commercial radio station. It was effectively Marconi and Westinghouse and all the rest of them trying to flog their wirelesses. But once the BBC came along, the Daily Mail, who've had a career of being in and out of radio throughout the last 100 years or so, I think that the first story that I found of them was with a guy called Valentine Smith, who was their promotions manager. And he rented a boat out of Dundee to broadcast around the coast and say, buy the Daily Mail, and here's an orchestral piece of music. Well, the story goes that they got out of the Tay with their ship, and the sea was too rough for the transmitters to work. So rather than giving up, they went back and fitted huge loudspeakers and moored closer to the beach of all the seaside resorts, saying, "It's the Daily Mail." I mean, can you imagine that? A nice quiet day planned on the beach at Frinton, and this thing turns up. So there was the Daily Mail saying,
wow.
Understandably, we want a bit of this new media. We sell adverts in the paper. We want to sell adverts on the radio, and then they've been involved with commercial radio ever since, really. Then along came, give us a plug, Captain Plug or Captain Plush. And he had Radio Normandy, which really did give a big competition to the BBC, broadcasting from the French coast, and Radio Luxembourg. But of course, the British government, like many European governments, were saying, we don't need more radio. We've got the BBC. It does everything. It entertains,
what more do you need?
Informs. You don't need anything else. Not much. And this was the case really throughout much of Europe until 1958. And a smart guy thought, actually, if I put a ship off the coast and outside territorial waters, it wouldn't be legal, but it wouldn't be illegal. And Radio Mercure off the coast of Denmark in 1958 was the first pirate ship. And then the Dutch, who are never slow to miss a business deal, thought, we could do this. And Radio Veronica came along, which is still part of the Dutch national broadcasting system. And they were at sea from 1960 to 1974. Radio Nord in Sweden. And then people in Britain were looking at this, thinking, well, we could do this. And although Ronan O'Reilly was the man credited with starting Radio Caroline and will forever be known as the man behind Caroline, and Caroline will be the first offshore pirate station for the British Isles. But, it wasn't his idea. Lots of people had thought of it. The man that really deserves the credit, I think, is Alan Crawford, who was an Australian music publisher and wanted to start his Project Atlanta, Radio Atlanta. And he used to do cover versions, not him in particular. He would sell cover versions on records that you could buy from Rivali and Titbits, all these weekly magazines, of all the latest songs. So instead of paying you 6 shillings and 8pence for the latest Beatles song, you could get 6 top 20 songs, but cover versions. So they weren't the Beatles, they were the Bacon Boys, I think was one of the groups he used. But you could buy these records, and he wanted to promote his own records. He didn't have the money that he needed initially, so he went to this guy, Ronan O'Reilly, who came from a quite wealthy Irish background, and said, look, I've got this idea. Would your father, who I know is wealthy, be interested in investing? And here are the papers that tell you can do it without ending up in the Old Bailey. And of course, I took those home and pinched the idea, stole a march on Crawford, and Radio Caroline was the first. And part of the deal, the arrangement, was that they would help Crawford in his Radio Atlanta. But who was going to win? The guy whose father owned the port where they were fitting out the ship, or the Australian guy that had got this other ship? It was Ronan and Caroline.
Gosh, I mean, already what a tale. And I love the fact as well that, one of the things that attracted me to the BBC origin story was a bit of rivalry. Peter Eckersley in Essex versus Arthur Burrows in London. It's like two people head to head. And from that comes this whole industry. And similarly here, you've got a lovely origin story of two people, there's one idea and the other sort of poaches it. And from that, innovation, pioneering, joy, wonderful.
Yeah. I mean, the story goes on, and I said it's a bonkers story. I mean, had Caroline not been the first, there were also plans for, I mean, get this. Can you imagine the nation's teenagers saying, oh, I come home from school every day and listen to The Voice of Slough, which was one of the plans for one of the commercial radio stations in 1962. There was the whole load going on. Another one, GBOK, was destined to broadcast off the English coast, but
it's a good name.
The ship that they had got stuck in the mud, eventually got over to Sheerness, and then the story goes that the GPO got to hear of it and they gave in, whereas with O'Reilly's ship and Crawford's ship, they were out of the country. They were on the border of Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, and nobody knew about this discreet port, so they could fit the ships out, just imagine.
So I want to get specific on a couple of things if I can. So when roughly are we talking? That's one question I've got. And how far offshore are we talking about as well? Is it, within reach?
Okay. Initially it was. We're talking 1964. So the ship left Greenore in Southern Ireland in the last week of March 1964, anchored on Good Friday 64 off Felixstowe. And this was such a shock for the BBC and the state, because the GPO had got wind of Alan Crawford's plans for Radio Atlanta. They knew nothing, absolutely nothing of Radio Caroline. And when suddenly Simon D says, good evening, this is Radio Caroline, your all-day music station on 199. What the heck is that? The BBC, when you get to looking, and I know you're a regular at the written archive, when you get to looking at the BBC written archive, they just couldn't believe that somebody had the audacity to challenge them to broadcast. That's what we do, for goodness sake. And memos were going backwards and forwards. They set staff to write down the titles of the songs that they play and who was advertising and what they said. And they just couldn't believe that somebody could challenge their mighty role that they'd got as the nation's broadcaster. So this was 64. Caroline became the leader of the pack, and for 3 years, I was 10, 11, 12, 13 at the time. It was just magical to grow up with. Every week, it seemed, there was a new radio station. Radio London, Radio City, Radio England, Radio Scotland, Radio 270. It was just wonderful. But it got a bit murky. There was a murder, basically, not directly involving Caroline, but, there were some dodgy characters involved here, as well as the need to get radio opened up so that they could have commercial radio. And ultimately, the Postmaster General at the time, Anthony Wedgwood Benn, later Edward Short, had to do something about it. They couldn't allow this unauthorized, uncontrolled fleet of broadcasting ships to carry on. And they passed the Marine Offences Act in 1967, which outlawed the stations, and they were closed down with the exception of Caroline. And O'Reilly said, well, we're just playing records. For goodness sake, are you going to put us in prison for playing records? Well, yes, the law would have done that. So Caroline continued, reputedly, with an audience with Johnny Walker, and an audience of 23 million people on that night when Johnny said, this is Caroline, we're going to continue. And that went through another 6-7 months. They ran out of money, and the ships were pulled in by the people that had been servicing them. And they lay rotting in Amsterdam Harbour, and bits were stolen, they were looted, they were wrecks. You could argue they weren't that seaworthy before they went there, but they were wrecks. But lo and behold, 1972, the ships came up for auction. The original ship was scrapped, but a whole load of guys, including Ronan, got about £3,000. That's how much the ship was worth. Took it out to sea, completely uninhabitable, unseaworthy. Radio Caroline started again, this time from the Dutch coast, because at that time the Dutch hadn't got an anti-pirate law. They continued there until 1974. The Dutch introduced an anti-pirate law. The ship Caroline came back to the British coast, but this time 18 miles, 12 to 18 miles off the coast, where nobody could see what was going on. And went through the 70s until the ship sank. And the government obviously thought, oh, gosh, got rid of those pesky pirates again. But it was Caroline. So they went looking for another ship, which they found, and they still owned. Caroline had the Ross Revenge, which we still have. Came back in 1983 and continued at sea until 1990, 1991, when the British introduced the most draconian of laws, which meant that if I was smuggling people or arms or drugs, they couldn't really do much about it. But if I was sitting on a rusty old ship broadcasting to Britain by playing a Bruce Springsteen record, they could use military force to stop it. Gosh. And you can't argue about that. So Caroline's days at sea were numbered. You'd think that's the end of it, but no, there's a whole other chapter.
Well,
umpteen chapters after that.
Well, of course. All, by the way, we should say in your book, Radio Caroline, The True Story of the Boat That Rocked. Marvellous book, published by History Press. And people can find it more there. But we got to know more as well. I mean, I want you to, tell us as well about the present day Radio Caroline, of course, and how all that came in. But just so those eras you talk about there, the listenership sounds pretty huge at times. The peak of the listenership was vast.
Well, let's take the 60s when it was big time. 10 million listeners, perhaps that's a slight exaggeration under normal circumstances, but certainly in the millions. Simon D, Radio Caroline. Dave Lee Travis, Radio Caroline. Johnny Walker, Radio Caroline. Then you look at Radio London, Kenny Everett, John Peel, so many people's names that were household names. And then in the 70s, Caroline came back again, just as big in Holland until it was outlawed. And who knows how many people were listening to Radio Caroline and the Dutch service Radio Mi Amigo, but they were certainly surviving in the 70s, and then back in the 80s it comes. And it was out at sea at the same time as Laser 558. And between the two, they were decimating the ILR radio station figures, so much so that due to pressure from commercial radio, the DTI put what the guys called a spy boat out at sea to try and dissuade people from supplying the ships. But they survived. Most of us that worked on Caroline in the 80s eventually went to land-based commercial radio, and we used to look at the old, it's called Radar now, but JICRA figures, which were the audience research figures. And there was a whole gap of others, because they have, Radio 1, Radio 2, Invicta Radio, Essex Radio, whatever, and they'd have all of their figures. And then it would say others, 2 million. And where did this 2 million come from? I mean, they were listening to the pirates.
Yeah.
And Caroline sort of got to the point where basically after the 90s, she ran aground on the Goodwin Sands, one of the few ships to survive. And Caroline was left with a shipwreck, no money, no listeners, no way of broadcasting. But again, being innovative, they tried satellite radio, that didn't really work. Then they thought, it's internet radio. And we're talking 20, 30 years ago here. And people were saying, well, never heard of that. That's not going to catch on. Well, excuse me, Caroline, one of the first there, and it certainly pays off now. And this is the best bit, Paul. This is the bit that I love, that almost finishes the story off. About 7-8 years ago, Caroline applied for a community radio license, but rather than a local geographical community radio license, persuaded Ofcom that they wanted an audience of like-minded people. So I can't think what the right term is, but basically a bit of power. And they were prepared to continue on AM medium wave whilst everybody else was giving it up. So they were granted a community radio license, a community of interest. That's the term.
Okay.
So they got a license that covered much of East Anglia and has since been extended, but they needed to broadcast. And in this day and age, you can't live on a ship all the time, although the ship is still used. So they looked around for somewhere to broadcast. And on Orford Ness, which had been top secret throughout the 60s and 70s, was an installation that had been built by the British and American government to test over-the-horizon radar. And back at the turn of the century, they'd pulled out of that. So the building was just sitting there. So a couple of guys thought, well, this could come in handy. They'd got a bit of money. Let's buy the building. So leave that part there. Prior to the close down of that building, it had also been the base for the transmitters for the BBC World Service, who'd built loads and loads of huge 300-foot high antennas that are still off the Suffolk coast. And they moved. So everybody had left this building. The whole Orford Nest then became the property of National Trust. But this bit, which had been Cobra Mist and top secret, don't tell anybody, was bought by these two guys. So Caroline said, you got room there for our transmitter. Yes, yeah, you pay a bit of rent. We'll put your transmitter there. So Caroline's transmitter is now in a building built by the British and American government, but it gets so much better
Oh, I love
because
it.
the masts that are used to transmit the programs of Radio Caroline are the masts built by the British Broadcasting Corporation for the World Service.
Yes.
All
Wonderful.
100% legal. But, you've got to say, why on earth didn't the government realise what was going to come along? And they couldn't stop it. Why didn't they in 1964 say, OK, lads, look, go off the air. We'll sort out a law and then apply for the licence. Didn't work that way.
No. And how different would it have been if they had? I just don't know. The BBC
I don't think we'd have been talking about Radio Caroline now. It would have just been like, Capital or whatever, or Heart, or, it's just there. Just there.
And part of its history, part of its the joy of it is that plucky little upstart that really, well, not necessarily a little upstart, but this great, the fact that you've got a boat as well, and it's got all of these twists and turns in the story out facing off against this giant corporation, gives us that wonderful sense of nostalgia and character to it that wouldn't be there otherwise. If it was too easy for them, I don't think we would be, as you said, wouldn't be celebrating.
Of course not, Paul. No, it would have been easy peasy. And of course, the romance continues because the latest ship, which Caroline has owned since 1983 and is now owned by a charitable trust because it needs desperately to get into dry dock to be restored, not only ticks British social history boxes as far as broadcasting is concerned, but it was the former Rolls-Royce of the British distant deep water fishing fleet. She was the pride of Grimsby. She still holds world records for catching more fish than any other trawler. And Caroline's got her. So, the people in Grimsby get so excited about the fact that Ross Revenge still exists. And we have the ship. And the plan, as I say, is to get her into dry dock and renovate her. It's going to cost millions. And there's a crowdfunding campaign at the moment, which is up to about 300,000, I think, with donations from listeners and well-wishers. And the plan is to go to the likes of the National Lottery and say, hey, can you stick another couple of noughts on the end of that? Because it's going to cost a bob or two.
Yeah, of course.
But on all counts, I can see no argument at all as to why that ship shouldn't survive with the fight that it's had, the fact that it should have either been crushed or sunk or destroyed on a number of occasions. And the ship's as plucky as the radio station. Yeah. And when you go to Grimsby, you'll realise how much the whole population miss the fishing industry. So, there's no argument. Renovate the thing.
It goes to show if you just wait long enough, then rebels become heritage. And these people who
I think you've got a point.
The title of pirate radio has never been better chosen than for this story. The fact you've got a little plucky little boat that's sort of sometimes dodging the authorities. It's a wonderful tale, and your book forwards by Emperor Roscoe and Keith Skews and Paul McKenna. So you've got people who were there at the start and all part of the story as well. And where can we go to find out more then on both? We can listen to Radio Caroline online, of course, and indeed your own website from to know about yourself and your books.
Yeah, there's a whole list of them here, Paul. Initially, go to radiocaroline.co.uk. And there's all you need to know, and it'll point you to all the various services because Caroline has 3 regular services as well. All right, Radio 1, Radio 2, Radio 3, Radio 4, but we've got 3, so we're heading in that direction.
Pretty good going.
And the Caroline website has a whole load of information. My personal website is rayradio.co.uk, but there are other fabulous sites that will give you a real insight. Go to the offshoreradio.co.uk. I think it's the Offshore Radio Hall of Fame. A guy called John Meyer runs that. It's fabulous. There are excerpts from every disc jockey that broadcasts offshore and recordings. And there's a monthly magazine that's been going for 50 years now, Offshore Echoes. There's a 3-monthly magazine that's been going for 50 years now, Offshore Echoes, and fabulous research, much like you've been doing, of articles and stuff from the archives that suddenly appeared. And you think, wow, this is amazing reading all of this stuff. Use the beware. As soon as you delve into the world of looking at offshore radio, you'll be hooked on it.
We'll link to your marvellous book, of course, Radio Caroline, The True Story of the Boat That Rocked. And thank you for amplifying the story continually through that, but also telling us all about it here, Ray Clark. Very good of you.
Thank you for the invite, Paul.
Thank you.
And just my little apology at the end. As you've noticed, I get a bit passionate about it. It is my mastermind topic. I don't know anything else. and I hear myself say, calm down.
No apology required. Not on this podcast.
It's magical, isn't it?
If there's anywhere for radio nerds, come on, this is the place. That's what the listener knows what they're getting on this podcast. Thank you, Ray. Ray Clark is the author of Radio Caroline, The True Story of the Boat That Rocked. His website is rayradio.co.uk. And as he said, also, you can head to offshoreradio.co.uk, offshoreechoes.com. Plenty more to discover there about pirate radio over the years. Now, I did say at the very start of the episode that R.H. Wood, that engineer in charge of outside broadcasts, who I'll be talking about at Leicester Comedy Festival this Saturday. And if you missed that and would like the show near your patch, I do tour an evening of very old radio, but I'm considering, do I start to tour for Monarchs under Mike? I think an evening of very old radio is still the go-to show to tour. But I have had people at those shows in Norfolk last week, for example, and Suffolk and Cambridgeshire, did some lovely shows there. People asking, is there a sequel? Maybe For Monarchs under Mike is the one I should be touring next. If you'd like it near your patch, do let me know. But yeah, I'll be talking about R.H. Wood, that engineer in charge of outside broadcasts. And at the very start of this episode, I played you some of the more official and notable classic clips that he's responsible for, from sporting events to royal events. Well, one of his most regrettable broadcasts that he was actually behind, although let's not say he was responsible for it, was the broadcast when commentator Tommy Woodroffe was commentating on the Coronation Fleet Review at Spithead in 1937. Famously, Tommy Woodroffe had had a few drinks. I'll play you the clip shortly. But in the words of R.H. Wood, let's give it some context.
This is the regional programme.
The principal commentator was the likeable Lieutenant Commander Tommy Woodroffe, who already that year covered the Derby, the Grand National, the Coronation, with a magnificent description of the scene from the top of Constitution Hill.
The illumination of the fleet.
He was, of course, now retired from the Royal Navy, but obviously particularly well qualified to describe what was taking place.
Once again, we're taking you on board HMS Nelson for a description of the scene at Spithead tonight by Lieutenant Commander Thomas Woodroffe.
Fortunately, he was sent to pick up some atmosphere on HMS Nelson, the ship on which he had begun his own training as a rookie, and his many friends took the opportunity of renewing their acquaintance. The reunion became something of a prolonged celebration. When he eventually arrived for the broadcast, both Captain and I were rather concerned about his overconfident manner. I signalled a message to the broadcasting house warning them of his position, but at that moment, since the commentary had to begin, there was nothing we could do but fade him in.
At the present moment, the whole fleet is lit up.
His narration was jocular.
When I say lit up, I mean lit up by fairy lamps.
Became increasingly carefree minute by minute.
We've forgotten the whole Royal Review.
An amusing atmosphere was generated as the nation listened.
We've forgotten the Royal Review.
And presumably more and more people turned to their neighbours and said something like, "Hey, listen to this. I think this bloke on the BBC's a bit merry."
The whole thing is lit up by fairy lamps. It's fantastic. It isn't afraid at all.
Anyone who had the fortune to hear the broadcast will remember a few of Tommy's expressions, which appeared to be repeated with remarkable frequency.
It's just... it's fairyland. The whole fleet is in fairyland.
Such as, the fleet's lit up. Nothing unusual in that. It was taking place at night, but the skies below did require a little more explanation, and several other phrases seemed to indicate that his judgment was about 180 degrees out of true.
Now, if you'll follow me through... if you don't mind.
It was like reliving my old days as an emergency newsreader in Manchester.
The next few moments, you'll find the fleet doing odd things. Now, at the present moment, the New York opposite me is lit out. And when I say a fleet is lit up in lamps, I mean she's outlined, the whole ship's outlined in little lamps.
I sat helpless, not knowing what to do about this unusual commentary which was booming out everywhere. I tried cutting into his monitoring headphones in the hope that I could gently cue him out, but he ignored me and went on talking.
I'm sorry, I was telling some people to shut up talking.
In the end, I simply faded him out, still talking, and raced up to the commentary position where we exchanged several impolite words. The captain and his aides contacted me immediately. All I could do was apologise to them. The fleet took to sea for manoeuvres, and I despondently returned to my cabin. A little while later, I was woken up by a knock at my cabin door. A rating told me that the duty officer wished to see me immediately. It turned out that Tommy had escaped from the cabin into which he had been discreetly locked, and was thoroughly enjoying himself in the officer's mess, which he had opened up. I went down and managed by persuasion and intimidation to get him back safely into bed. The words of R.H. Wood there. The book is A World in Your Ear. I thoroughly recommend it if you can get hold of a copy. And if you'd like to join me, Leicester Comedy Festival this Saturday, the 7th of February, presuming you've missed that though, do get in touch if you'd like it near your patch. And maybe we'll do an R.H. Wood special sometime here on the British Broadcasting Century podcast. My thanks this episode to our guest, Ray Clark. His book, once again, Radio Caroline, The True Story of the Boat That Rocked. And do join us next time on the British Broadcasting Century podcast, where indeed we should be bringing you the first broadcast, Armistice, the tale behind it, with Professor Rachel Cowgill. Stay subscribed, do a like and share the podcast if you see it online, or you're able to share it with your own network online. If you don't have a network, then phone someone, write a letter, send a telegram, a carrier pigeon, and say, hey folks, listen to this podcast. Because this is the British Broadcasting Century, a solo-produced podcast. It's only made by Paul Carenza, so that's why he needs all the help he can get, the poor fella. It's not made by the BBC at all. If you especially like the podcast, you could support us on patreon.com/Paul Carenza. For £5 a month, you can get extra writing and videos and things, and all of that helps keep the podcast afloat with books and web hosting and such matters. Your ratings and reviewings are also very much appreciated. And do join us next time as we inform, educate and entertain about the first broadcast armistice on the BBC, not pirate radio, of course, here on the British Broadcasting Century.
It's fairyland. The whole fleet is in fairyland.
Come on, Margaret.